Okay, hello. Willkommen to This and Dat on the U.S. Labor Day holiday. Gonna look at the second of two articles that are coming up in the class unity discussion by Lapavitsas, and that essentially is about financialization, and the argument, of course, is that is financialization a feature, not a bug, of late capitalism? And is it about capital seeking profits in the realm of finance? Giving the kind of agency to capital is an interesting question, and one worth raising. You might ask those kinds of questions in the context of this little tweet that from those relatively tanky folks at Midwestern Marx, talking about how the accumulation of money capital is distinct from the accumulation of real capital, and not so much that it proves a point, although it's kind of amusing to see it in TikTok, that there is a distinction that you can make between money capital and real capital. But it's, how much of a distinction it is or isn't is an interesting question, one that is important, of course, for those studying modern monetary theory. But it's a contingent one. It is if capitalism is not a permanent thing, this is just simply a transitory element. And as I've discussed before, that MMT describes a body of inquiry, a theory building project that is important at this particular stage in capitalism, but that at some moment, and perhaps thanks to modern monetary theory, is a way in which we move towards socialism. So in that sense, I think it's a very positive development. It's problematic to think that it is a kind of permanent feature of the current status of history. I do not think that necessarily is the case, because at some moment there may be no need to have money, but that's a whole nother story. Anyway, that's one element of that. Now, so the details of these kinds of movements are important because, as the course has been describing it, it is this feature of financialization that helped bring on, and watching the movie Big Short has sort of, I hope, concretized at least a little bit the drama itself, concretized the way in which financialization operates. Didn't see very many working people in that particular movie, but it's pretty clear that all the folks involved were working pretty hard and doing something. Now, whether you count that as labor is an interesting question. Not, and it's worth arguing, but I think the bigger picture is, the larger state of the economy. Let's put it that way. So this is the article. It's the financialization of capitalism, profiting without producing, by Kostas Lapavitsas. The global crisis of the 2000s has lifted the curtain on the transformation of mature and developing capitalist economies during the last 3 decades, confirming the pivotal role of finance, both domestically and internationally. Finance-related capital permeates economic activity and interacts with financial markets in ways capable of generating enormous profits, but also precipitating global crises. Contemporary capitalism is financialized, and the turmoil commencing in 2007 could be called, I think it's fairly obvious, a crisis of financialization. Now, let me stop there for a moment and say financialization comes in many forms and appears in a variety of ways. You could say that Formula One, for example, is a thing about, it's more about financialization than it is about racing cars. Um, it is about the kind of global reach of a certain type of trade. It is the image of various national economies in a much larger international context. Um, it is about, on the one hand, national pride, but it is also the movements of individual um, capitalists at work. For example, there are no Russian drivers anymore in Formula One because they were too tied to the financing of specific military actions. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing is to actually, and not institutionally. He ostensibly removed himself, but it's just interesting to see how long a Russian driver would last, given that Russia invaded Ukraine. Anyway, back to the story. The economic processes and social relations characteristic of financialization represent a milestone in the development of capitalism. The catalyst of the crisis in 2007 was speculative mortgage lending to the poorest workers in the USA during the 2000s, the loans being subsequently traded in securitized form in global financial markets. Let me just sort of say parenthetically right now, it perhaps was the poorest workers, but in fact, I would assert that they were more middle class on the one hand, and also this whole securitization deal doesn't really affect the poorest of workers. But anyway, that's another story. It is hard to exaggerate what an extraordinary fact this is. Under conditions of classical 19th century capitalism, it would have been unthinkable for a global disruption of accumulation to materialize because of debts incurred by workers, including the poorest. Now, that, of course, is very, very true, that statement, and the divergence between capital or the increase in inequality, in terms of, wages versus capital and income versus GDP and all that other stuff. Fact is, these things are happening. They exist. I don't think it's controversial. It simply is, how are they dealt with? The questions of credit and debt. And as we were looking at before, David Graeber et al., that's definitely a feature. And the problem, of course, are the institutional or the detail elements of it that can, in fact, cause ruin on the one hand, but can also create gain, as I think you could see in when we were watching the movie The Big Short. However, this is precisely what has happened under conditions of financialized capitalism, an economic and social system that is much more sophisticated than its 19th century predecessor. Financialization has emerged gradually during recent decades. To be sure, capitalist economies are continually restructured due to pressures of competition and the underlying drive to maintain profitability. Note, of course, that the Big Short ended with a little commentary on bespoke tranches at the end, talking about how there still is customized, collateralized debt obligations and other kinds of things, and there are family resemblances among current instruments within the current economy that can and could and perhaps will cause problems as soon as next year. However, some transformations have a distinctive historical significance, and financialization is one of those. The change that has taken place in mature capitalist economies and societies since the late 1970s requires appropriate attention to be paid to finance. Context and structural aspects of financialization. Mature capitalism has been marked by deep transformations of the economy and society. Towards the end of the 19th century, for instance, there emerged new methods of production in heavy industry, accompanied by the rise of monopolistic joint stock enterprises. This revolves largely about primary industries like steel, for example, and improvements in steel, iron coke, the application of coke, and blah blah blah, improvement in steel processing, for example, among many other things. But steel is kind of the front end of this. But of course, steel doesn't exist by itself. It requires iron ore, mining, um, and the demand for it, of course, comes in kind of interesting ways, right? It's better to have a ironclad or a steel ship for not only military purposes but for trading purposes. The change coincided with a long depression, 1873 to 96. Note when this happens, of course. This is that important moment, where we see a shift from the British to the American Industrial Revolution. I mean, they both exist. They exist in parallel, but you can see there's this moment where it just grows quicker because of greater capital resources. Anyway, and led to a rebalancing of global productive power away from Britain and toward the United States and Germany. Similarly, at the end of the Second World War, mass consumption emerged across several developed countries based on methods of mass production. A long boom occurred. This all occurs, right? Our generation at this present moment is sort of the beneficiary of that long boom occurred, lasting until 1973-74, during which production became increasingly dominated by transnational monopolistic enterprises, while finance operated under a system of controls domestically and internationally. For nearly 3 decades, the USA was the dominant economic force in global production and trade. The transformation represented by financialization is of a similar order of importance. Since the 1970s, there have been profound changes in production methods deriving from information and telecommunications technologies. Transnational enterprises have become dominant over global production and international trade. Let me just stop there for a second and say, this is the whole issue of the connected anti-capitalism, globalization sort of movement. And of course, it involves all kinds of things like climate and supply chains and all that other stuff. This article makes the contrast between, at least the front end of the article, between Fordist and post-Fordist production. Fordist production being of the sort of assembly line type. Post-Fordist production is of the disintegrating flexible production technologies that do backward cost shifting, and it's sort of like a doubled globalized process where you can move things all over the place and assemble them in a variety of different places, and then come up with whatever you're going to come up with. Now that doesn't represent the entire productive sphere. Note, of course, that there's uneven development everywhere, and we're still currently at that case, where the Russians are trying to steal gold in Africa, and we're still building far too many things out of concrete, and et cetera, et cetera. There's all kinds of stuff. Back to the article. The center of gravity of global productive capacity has partly shifted from mature economies in the West, the global North, toward rising economies in the East, primarily China. Meanwhile, the institutional framework of capitalist activity has been altered as deregulation has prevailed in important markets, above all for labor and finance. Throughout this period, and note that important markets for labor and finance includes the fact that one of the reasons why you have this flexible production or disintegrated or post-Fordist production, sort of production that has been outsourced in that particular sense, is because of wage rates, right? It's cheaper labor, more stuff can be produced, and in fact, in certain places with equal quality, particularly in advanced technologies. Throughout this period, accumulation has lacked dynamism in mature countries. Inequality has been exacerbated, and crises have become sharper and more frequent. The most striking feature of the period, nonetheless, has been the rise of finance, the start of which can be usefully placed in the late 1970s. The financial sector became progressively larger in the 1950s and 60s while still operating within the regulatory framework characteristic of the long post-war boom. However, even by the late 1970s, the domestic and international importance of finance remained modest. The 3 decades that followed, that is from the 70s up through the end of the century, have witnessed unprecedented expansion of financial activities, rapid growth of financial profits, permeation of the economy and society by financial relations, and domination of economic policy by the concerns of the financial sector. At the same time, the productive sector in mature economies has exhibited mediocre growth performance. Profit rates have remained below the levels of the 50s and 60s. Unemployment has generally risen and become persistent, and real wages have shown no tendency to rise in a sustained manner. Well, yes and no, depending on where you are. An asymmetry has emerged between the sphere of production and the ballooning sphere of circulation. Remember Department 1 and Department 2 again. The rise of finance has been predicated on a radical alteration of the monetary framework of capitalist accumulation, both internationally and domestically. International monetary conditions have been stamped by the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971 to 73. Bretton Woods had enforced the convertibility of the US dollar into gold at $35 to the ounce, thus fixing exchange rates during the long boom. Its collapse, remember who was in charge during this period, at least in the American economy. Its collapse led to the gradual emergence of alternative international monetary arrangements based on the US dollar functioning as incontrovertible quasi-world money. Note that this is a turmoil sort of period that results in ultimately stuff like Reaganism and all that other sort of stuff, but it was sort of brought about by a certain, you could say, Republican view of the world. The new arrangements have generated considerable instability of exchange and interest rates, thereby spurring the growth of international financial markets, growth of international capital flows during the same period, partly in response to exchange, and interest rate instability has led to financialization in developing countries. Domestic monetary conditions, in contrast, have been marked by the steady accumulation of power by central banks as controllers of credit money backed by the state. Central banks have emerged as the dominant public institution of financialization, the defender of the interests of the financial sector. The ascendancy of central banks is hardly surprising, since financialization in general would have been impossible without active and continuous intervention by the state. It's all very collusive. Financialization is dependent on the state to deregulate the financial system with regard to prices, quantities, functions, and cross-border flows of capital. This is the neoliberal thing that of which we are still the beneficiary, or whatever, the victim. Equally, financialization is dependent on the state to regulate the adequacy of its own capital, the management of risk, and the rules of competition among financial institutions. Even more decisively, financialization is dependent on the state to intervene periodically to underwrite the solvency of banks, to provide extraordinary liquidity, and to guarantee the deposits of the public with banks. And this is really no different than its role in the Depression, for example. But ultimately, however, the rise of finance has resulted from changes deep within capitalist accumulation. 3 characteristic tendencies of accumulation in mature countries have shaped financialization as a structural transformation of contemporary capitalism. Number 1, first, non-financial enterprises have become increasingly involved in financial processes on an independent basis, often undertaking financial market transactions on their own account. Let's think of some examples. Car companies, their finance divisions are actually much more important than their automobile production, and their position in the economy, in fact, is really important, even though there's this weird connection between the two. The financialization of industrial and commercial enterprises has affected their profitability, internal organization, and investment outlook. Non-financial enterprises have become relatively more remote from banks and other financial institutions. And also, you can see that just this wide range of, in some cases, very uninsured or fuzzy looking financial type institutions, and of course, aided by digital processes. Second, banks have focused on transacting in open financial markets with the aim of making profits through financial trading than through outright borrowing and lending. If you can get the position of this, that there are stuff that you can do with capital, but in some ways, just the motion can gain you a certain degree of profitability. At the same time, banks have turned towards individual and household income as a source of profit, often combining trading in open markets with lending to households or collecting household savings. Note, this is the issue of the thrifts, that is savings and loans. There's this period where the savings and loan was not technically a bank for some people. And there was this moment at which you could actually just call it the same thing as a full service bank. And the labeling got a little weird, as it has with all kind of, sort of bank-like entities. Third, individuals and households have come increasingly to rely on the formal financial system to facilitate access to vital goods and services, including housing, education, health, and transport. The savings of households and individuals have also been increasingly mobilized by the formal financial system. Financialization reflects a growing asymmetry between production and circulation, particularly the financial component of the latter during the last 3 decades. The asymmetry has arisen as the financial conduct of non-financial enterprises, banks, and households has gradually changed, thus fostering a range of aggregate phenomena of financialization. The telling aspects of the transformation has been the rise of profits accruing through financial transactions, including new forms of profit that could be unrelated, even unrelated to surplus value. This process can be summed up as financial expropriation. So this is financial activity above and beyond the use of capital to create surplus value. New social layers have emerged as financial profit has burgeoned. Now, their intellectual origins for financialization. The concept of financialization is closely associated with Marxist political economy, whether implicitly or explicitly, or as even a cursory glance at the literature would reveal. First, it hints at an epochal change of capitalism, and the latter has traditionally invited Marxist analysis. We're in what some people have problematized as the late phase of late capitalism. It's not over yet. Second, it suggests systemic or aggregate transformation of the economy and society, which has similarly attracted Marxist interest. Darn those materialists. Third, and here things have become much more complex, it carries a whiff of disapproval by tacitly suggesting a problematic relationship between finance and the rest of the economy. This is, again, broadly consistent with Marxist theoretical predilections, but considerable care is required not to lapse into treating finance as a parasitical or speculative set of activities, thus assigning to financialization a pathological character that would be misleading. Yeah, it's easy to do that, even though they kind of, they're parasites and hosts or, whatever. Hegel doesn't talk enough about that. He talks more about master-slave as opposed to parasites and hosts. Close association of financialization with Marxism goes back at least to the insights advanced by the current of Monthly Review, the journal Monthly Review, Magdoff, Sweezy, Foster, McChesney. It's bad when you're on a faculty that is considers McChesney and considers him too radical for your faculty. That's just like dumb. But I actually I was at one of his job talks, and it's just like I had to go at the end and say and apologize, saying, we really aren't that reactionary. Anyway, for these Marxist authors, financialization is a characteristic trend of mature capitalism, ultimately deriving from the production of a surplus that cannot easily be absorbed. The normal state of the monopolistic capitalist economy is to be overwhelmed by surplus. This idea is that it's sort of a residual of overproduction or underconsumption kind of views of stuff. It follows that methods must emerge through which the surplus would be absorbed either in production or in consumption, because it would otherwise lead to stagnation of the productive sector. This is an important point on Marxist analysis of that there's always this kind of premise of stagnation before the crisis, which we're seeing a little less of. In other words, the stagnation phase might actually be very short, and then the crisis even worse. From the perspective of Monthly Review, the theory of surplus absorption offers a ready explanation for the epochal events of the mid-70s and the subsequent emergence of financialization. By the 1970s, surplus absorption had become problematic, prices had burst out, and the specter of stagnation hung over mature capitalist countries. Recall that this is the period of the height and then the decline of the one of the larger wars, the Vietnam War. As a result, capital began to search for refuge in the sphere of circulation and above all in the speculative activities of finance. Financialization has emerged as a decisive way of absorbing the investable surplus that inundated the sphere of production by channeling it to the realm of finance. More broadly, financialization is one of three epical trends of capitalist accumulation in the 20th century, together with the slowing down of the rate of growth and the rise of monopolistic multinational corporations. Monthly Review has broken an innovative path by claiming that financialization reflects an epochal shift in the balance between the spheres of production and the sphere of circulation in favor of the latter. Now, this is why you could argue that that's why cultural things are more important. This is an appropriate point of departure for a theory of financialization. However, the current has not offered a detailed analysis of the altered conduct of the agents of the capitalist economy, that is, productive capitalists, bankers, and workers, which has produced the changing balance between the two spheres. If financialization is not explicitly related to the operations of the fundamental agents of the capitalist economy, its content will remain unclear. Now, that's the kind of current point. You make comments about who the working class is. Working class, it has a pretty big nut at the end of the month. There's actually, fairly high wages, et cetera, in people who have, ideologically speaking, a working class point of view, which is the current confusion, at least in the U.S. Political process. So anyway, just be aware that the kind of false consciousness is much more widely defined, as it were. The epical aspect of financialization is even more prominent in the work of Giovanni Arrighi, which also has strong affinities with the Marxist political economy. The original insight in connection with Arrighi's theory, however, goes back to Ferdinand Brauddel's analysis of the longue durée of capitalism. This is the French Annales School of History. The idea that agency is not about famous people or specific dominant change agents, but rather changes in other stuff, resources or lack thereof, and evolution of things that don't necessarily are clearly identifiable. In the second volume of Civilization and Capitalism, Braudel proposed a pattern of recurrent historical rise of finance based mostly on examining the expansion of capitalist world trade since the early modern era. The trade is perhaps an easier way to measure some of that because the agency issues are problematic, partially because there's no data and there's a variety of other crazy things that make the historical problem more problematic. On each occasion that finance has emerged as the ascendant capitalist activity, the sign of autumn, fall, has marked the state power that's to lead in financial development. From this perspective, the financialization of a social formation is an omen of its decline. In his long 20th century, Arrighi adopted Brauddel's insight on the recurrent rise of finance, turning it into an argument about the financialization of contemporary capitalism. Arrighi's true interests, nonetheless, lay in elaborating a theory of historical hegemony in the evolution of capitalism. Arrighi claimed that the capitalist world economy tends to contain a hegemonic power that evolves in a cyclical pattern. Now, that's, that needs a little more unpacking. Hegemonic powers succeed each other as their prowess in production and trade declines, while the sphere of finance grows. Now, you could argue that, let's say, between the United Kingdom, Britain, and the US, that there's a shift in hegemonic roles that occurs. It's not a big shift, and one doesn't go completely, belly up, but there is a shift from Europe to America, and then back from America to Europe at some moment. Financialization thus represents autumn, that is, as in spring, summer, autumn, and winter, in the cyclical trajectory of a particular hegemonic power. The historical path of hegemony has traversed Genoa, the Netherlands, Britain, and the USA. On each occasion, the newly dominant power, note that these are sea powers, right? The hegemony is sort of associated with a shift historically and sort of a global trade power. In each occasion, the newly dominant powers emerge partly through availing itself of the financial resources of the declining and financializing hegemony. In this light, contemporary financialization, including the global crisis that began in 2007, are aspects of the long-term decline of U.S. hegemony. And we can argue that that's still happening. And it would be an interesting argument, the way you can front end it with a variety of data, and you can actually see it in certain elements that have unfortunately made the political situation complicated. Two analytically important points stand out in Arrighi's theory. The first is the association of financialization with declining productive vigor and thus waning hegemonic power. Arrighi's theoretical point of departure is different from Baran and Sweezy's absorption of surplus. So you see that there is a difference here. But the outcome is similar. The productive sector has lost the fire to accumulate as financialization has burgeoned. So there is a kind of trade-off, and you could say an equilibrium relation among these things between the productive and the circulative spheres. The epical turn of the capitalist economy towards finance reflects a malaise in the realm of accumulation, while at the same time exacerbating the weakness of production and trade. And you can see that in this sort of globalized spread. Globalization has caused, on the one hand, a wonderful expansion. On the other hand, there are weaknesses in it, as we were talking before about, jamming up the Suez with a container ship. The second point, and again, similarly to monthly reviews, that Arrighi's analysis of financialization encourages attention to be paid to the returns to capitalist activity. That is, financialization is reflected in high profits from financial transactions compared to other activities. Now, this is sort of a relative relation. Arrighi's work does not clearly spell out the mechanisms and patterns through which profit derives from finance, but has motivated the path-breaking studies by Greta Kipner. Her work is the first systematic attempt to give empirical content to the claim by Monthly Review, Arrighi and others, that financialization is about capital seeking profits in the realm of finance. Now, the goal, of course, it just as an aside here, it is about wealth building ultimately. So we're just seeing a matter of emphasis. It's not that production has been given up. It's still uneven. We just see a different emphasis, and this emphasis is no different. You could even argue, and I'm not going to do that here, is to argue that financialization exists at various earlier moments in history. The adoption of, for example, paper money relative to gold in the case of late medieval, early Renaissance or Baroque economies. And so certain ways in which we talk about that, there is financialization going on in those periods as well. It just isn't as dense, let's put it that way. Further theoretical approaches of Marxist origin similarly associate the rise of finance with the secular transformation of the capitalist economy, often noting decline or stagnation of the sphere of production. This is a productivist bias. This outlook can be found, for instance, in the work of the Regulation School, which discussed financialization already in the 1990s. Regulation School is a French deal, and it's pretty significant in the literature because obviously in the post-war period, you're looking at all kinds of state structures and attempts to look at, how to organize new economies, et cetera, and how to reconcile the issues of neocolonialism as well as post-colonialism and a variety of other things. So all of that is woven together in a body of literature that's actually very interesting literature and never studied in the U.S. for whatever national reason, but it's largely a European viewpoint on regulation. The regulationist approach to financialization has resulted partly from the search for the new regime of accumulation. There's a broad discussion in a variety of literatures, including political science literature, about this idea of certain kinds of constructs for, you don't want to call them movements, I suppose, and particularly since they're built on political, on politics, on statutory elements or regulations or rules. So a regime of accumulation is part of coordinating the economy and government in a kind of joint sort of process, and associating it with, on the productionist side, Fordism. So on the assumption that the old regime of Fordism, that is assembly line production, large scale industry, the American model of the Industrial Revolution, came to an end in the 1970s. Now, that's, these are very arbitrary divisions and it's very uneven, but you could say that all of these things occurred, but, it's previewed by a whole bunch of other things. Deming in the early post-war period and just-in-time production introduced in post-war Japan, for example, can be argued as sort of an end to Fordism, but, you don't want to go there. By the second half of the 1990s, Chenet had already proposed the term regime of accumulation with financial dominance, a term that he deployed within a Marxist framework briefly discussed below. The Regulation School appropriated the term, that is, regime of accumulation with financial dominance, and deployed it extensively within its own theoretical framework. For regulationists, the crisis of the 1970s, that is the oil crisis and et cetera, Vietnam War, blah, 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 and the ensuing period of turbulence have resulted from the exhaustion of the elements characteristic of the period of Fordism in the decades following the Second World War. That is, mass production, rising productivity, and rising real wages. All of those things occurred because of World War II, right? National production, overproducing, outproducing your enemies, which is what the United States does. And after a boost from Lend-Lease, the Russians do that as well, at least for a period, focusing mainly not on consumer stuff, but, military goods. Thus, a new regime of accumulation might have begun to emerge based on finance. Frederick Lorden has proposed that a financialized regime of accumulation has perhaps begun to form around the ascendant realm of finance, replacing the lost material basis of Fordist regulation. Orleans more clearly proposed the notion of regulation occurring through the trading of capital in financial markets, an idea that Boyer has attempted to model in relationship to the operations of the stock exchange. That's sort of an underserved literature, and unfortunately, needs to be worked on more and probably needs to be covered more in business schools, but that's another story. Regulation through finance can have problematic effects for the performance of accumulation, including rates of growth, output, and so on. In subsequent work, Michel Aglietta and Antoine Reberu have further developed the notion of patrimonial capitalism, whereby income accrues through shareholding and could compensate for stagnant real wages. There's also other Marxist work on the rise of finance that does not necessarily relate it to malfunctioning production, but which remains important for the analysis of financialization. And not mentioned here, of course, is the entire information economy side of the relation between production and circulation. Chenet was one of the first to study financialization in conjunction with globalization and international capital flows, stressing the advancing integration of national financial systems. Chenet draws his analytical categories directly from Marx's analysis, but also paid particular attention to the role of rentiers in mature capitalist economies. So, rentier analysis has returned. It was de-emphasized because you didn't want to say that only one person, or the particulars as opposed to the universals of rent seeking, but that's been an issue. Thus, Schnee has emphasized the dominance of financial interests, the dictatorship of creditors, like the dictatorship of the proletariat, over industrial and other capital, which is given to globalization the character of rentier capitalists. It's unfortunate that hasn't caught on enough. Duminil and Levy, in a series of empirically based works, have related the growth of finance to the rise of neoliberalism, the latter representing a secular transformation of the capitalist system. From this perspective, financialization has meant higher profit rates for the financial sector, while also contributing to greater instability, above all, in the form of the crisis that broke out in 2007. You could see that the front end of this is stuff like the dot-com crisis and other smaller crises, but that there's a structural similarity. However, for Duminil and Levy, financial capital does not dominate industrial capital in the neoliberal era, unlike the first period of financial ascendancy at the start of the 20th century. This is the so-called progressive Gilded era, the trusts, etc. These writers also make the contentious claim that neoliberal capitalism has witnessed a transformation of class structure, such that a class of owners hold property through financial assets, while a larger managerial class draws profit in the form of wages and salaries. So this is an interesting, it's a very left version of it to try and distinguish between certain types of asset holdings and some that are more flexible and others not. It's a little, well, it's possible to talk about that. And some of it is the difference between tangible versus intangible wealth. But anyway, the relationship between industry and finance, or more specifically, the financialization of non-financial corporations. Okay, some companies have, kind of banks built in, others really don't, has been a major concern of Claude Sarfati. It is particularly relevant for our purposes that Sarfati rejects the notion of financial interests dominating industrial interests and capitalism. For Sarfati, Hilferding's notion of finance capital should be understood more broadly to encompass industrial enterprises that undertake financial transactions. A similar view has been developed by Francois Morin, who has examined the transformation of French enterprises and shown the emergence of a financial level of governance within large industrial capital. Finally, among French Marxists, Dominique Léon has proposed the term shareholding capitalism to capture the rise of finance and the concomitant transformation of capitalism in recent decades. Léon has suggested that, at least for France, non-financial enterprises have been instrumental in the transformation, including both through reliance on retained profits to finance investment, issuing financial assets in open markets, and fostering the preeminent role of institutional investors in contemporary finance. So, therefore, banks have also been transformed by turning to financial markets. This is important, that there is, on the one hand, simply holding money and spending more time being instrumental in its circulation. French writers aside, some of the most pertinent Marxist analysis of the rise of finance in recent years has been produced in India. Even though these writers have meticulously avoided the term financialization. Now, that's an interesting question as well, but that's for another different kind of writing. The work of Prabhat Patnaik and in particular has been concerned with the macroeconomic dimension of the rise of finance and the role of world money, this, the quasi-global money. For Patnaik, the ascendancy of finance has been associated with the centralization of capital, but has not led to the reemergence of Hilferding's finance capital. That is, to a coalescence of industrial with financial interests. Hilferding's model is fairly linear in that particular context, and this set of relations is probably much more diversified. Globalized finance is directed to financial markets and is largely speculative from that point of view. This approach has implications for the classical Marxist theory of imperialism, since the global ascendancy of finance is drawn into its orbit poor and developing countries, primarily through debt and financial liberalization. For Patnaik, imperialism necessarily entails developed countries encroaching on a pre-capitalist periphery and drawing benefits in terms of new markets and keeping wages low. Now, this is a very mechanical, kind of anachronistic way of thinking center. This is the old developmental model of center-periphery relations that supports a certain, you could say 20th century models of imperialism. Now, whether there's a 21st century model of imperialism that's different, that's a whole nother kind of set of questions. International stability is predicated upon maintaining the value of world money, namely the US dollar, reserve currency at all. However, the rise of finance has upset the management of domestic demand within the imperialist countries, thus enhancing instability. Moreover, the accumulation of debt by the USA, partly due to a lack of direct colonial control, the US has always had that problem, has created additional difficulties in holding the value of world money stable. In this context, C.P. Chandrasekhar has examined the mechanisms through which a small number of international financial enterprises have intermediated global capital flows, while Jayati Ghosh has argued in favor of regulating the domestic financial systems of developing countries. Now, that's kind of a given in that sense. So let me propose, I'm almost ready to stop for a moment because there's all this. This is going to go on for a while. And whether we want to go on for another 45 minutes of yammering, I might get there. It's unclear to me. Maybe I should stop at this moment and we'll take up the rest of this tomorrow. Because the interesting question at this moment is whether there is a Marxist theory of finance, and it's worth talking about, worrying about, especially when certain parties believe that that there's no absolute rent, there's only relative rents, differential rents, and a variety of other assumptions that get kind of messed up when you start talking about it. So let me stop for the moment to see whether there are any queries, questions, and brickbats. And taking up the second half tomorrow. Anyone?
One thought I had is I had read this book by Kevin Phillips.
Ah, yes.
Can't remember the whole title, but it's about the sort of end of the U.S. hegemony.
Yes.
Looks at past hegemonies and how they kind of turned over when their GDP became more than 50% financial services as opposed to, manufacturing and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Along with, there was some other circumstances I forget, but I'm sort of curious about how this intersects with that analysis. It sounds like it's kind of reflecting on the same thing.
Yes, it does. The more acute version of it is the British economy, which is, they make less stuff. And, they decided during Thatcher, right, they would become more of a service economy or a financialized economy. I mean, they still make stuff, and in fact, they make some great stuff. But similar to America, there's certain things that just aren't made here anymore. and it's unfortunate, and it's nice from a political point of view to claim that, oh, we're going to, whatever, for whatever reason, we're going to make more making stuff made in USA is going to happen. Yes and no, could happen. But I would say I'm not sure whether that's possible now, given that our competitors, whoever they may be, China mainly, can make pretty much the same stuff. And in fact, they make more of our stuff or whatever. And we may never get past that. And part of that was trading off or outsourcing or moving, whatever, certain things elsewhere. It was cheaper to use Chinese steel, right? You didn't have crappier buildings necessarily, and whatever. I want Kamala to embarrass Trump by claiming there's Chinese steel in some of his buildings. That just he'd blow a gasket or something.
Yeah, and have him try to explain it. Yeah.
Because there is Chinese steel in some of his buildings. It's just, no one ever talks about it. There's just stuff he can, anyone, with a real brain could, whoop up on him for that stuff. Anyway, carry on. Sorry, I interrupted.
Right,
Larry?
Well, yeah, thanks. Can't really think of any questions.
Let me, Joe had a question. Can financialization occur in the non-digital realm? Yes, of course it can. It doesn't have to be digital. Most financialization began in an analog era. But yes, high frequency trading, and it is incredibly problematic, and computing technical evolution lead naturally to, yes, it does. It's been pulled forward at the speed of light because of global trading. The fact, it's a 24-hour capital trading system, and it is problematic when you can sort of see the sort of thing evolve. And fortunately, there's a lot of breaks or little guardrails have been built into the system because there were, of course, abuses of the system. And chaos, and we're trying to keep that under control. And it'll get worse when if and when there are more, well, for example, military struggles have changed those relations a lot and make them more risky. Like the global fuel system, the fossil fuel situation on the globe it just made even more complicated by the fact that you can change the financial relations of something that's just moving along at 8 knots. I mean, all of this is so weirdly problematic because some things just take forever to move from one place to another, but then you've got all the capital, moving past it. Yes, it's all financialized. I mean, that you could say that everything is about financialization now. It wasn't that way at the emergence of the telegraph, for example, but it moved really fast towards that. Once you had, you could move past the telegraph to telephones, telephonic or radio transmissions. It would be a really interesting. Well, anyway, that's another story. I think capital got really screwed up when you could have a lot more higher speed transmission of financial data, like in the 1920s, I think. And not that you're going to claim that the global depression was a result of it, but I think there was a technology connection to that as well. Yes, World War I was about ships. It was about the competition between the German, the intentions of the late 19th century German Navy versus the prestige of the British Navy, and then of course all the other intermediaries. And then I think you frame it by, to me, the more interesting relation to World War I is not so much French and Germans, but or British and German stuff, But as I've suggested before, the Russians and the Japanese, that one little moment where the Japanese just, destroy the Russian Navy is just really an important moment for World War I, thinking about that. And then the other anachronistic thing, of course, is the naval treaty, which it's just sort of absurd that people just aren't, military planners weren't even thinking very properly relative to airplane technology and capital ships. It's just so ass backwards. It's just amazing.
That does remind me, I did want to ask. I was curious about, what was it, the Britain thing that happened in 73? Bretton Woods Agreement?
No, I don't know.
Enforced the convertibility of the US dollar into gold at $35 to the ounce.
Oh, yes, yes. It's just sort of untethering, tethering then untethering the gold. Changing those sets of relations, all of, at the same time as a bunch of other things, causes, on the one hand, the possibility of greater profits. On the other hand, creates more instability at other, in other sectors. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So this was Costas Lapavitsas.
Yeah.
He sounds Greek, and I was thinking, oh, well, did he like go to the same school as what's that other guy, Giannis Varoufakis?
Giannis. I don't know. They sound very similar. I mean, the theory that they're selling is pretty much similar, and of course, he's at the SAOS School of African and Oriental Studies, I think, and at the University of London. And so I'm sure that Lapavitsas knows Giannis Varoufakis. All
Yeah.
these great names. Well, Varoufakis was at where was he, at Anglia or Essex or whatever. His British teaching job was there.
Yeah. What did they call it? It was like capital seeking profit. Was getting to that right?
Financialization is about capital seeking profits in the realm of finance.
Yeah.
Which just sounds redundant in some ways because we're sort of all used to that, but it's not in seeking profits in the realm of production. It is about looking just simply at the financial sector. And The Big Short, nobody's walking around factories, right? You didn't see one damn factory in that movie, yeah? I mean, it's everybody in cabs and, whatever. And wandering around Wall Street, having lunch.
They wandered around that housing development too, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, there's probably a better way to do that movie, but this one is fine. I mean, it does what it, the Michael Lewis's sort of insider view of it. I think it's really, somebody's got to write that damn stuff. And it's really difficult to make it into a movie, but I think you could actually, made it more metaphorically into a good movie. But it would look campy probably.
Well, I like the sort of interjections, like when they had can't remember. Oh, Selena, is that Selena Gomez at the like the card table or whatever, and then Margot Robbie in the bathtub, sort of interjecting.
That punctuates it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's the way McKay wanted, whatever the narrative, the mise en scène to sort of look like. Let's see. Lane was talking a little bit. Yeah, Joe, I think Sorkin could have made it a little bit more poetic, I suppose. Would have made it more poetic. And thank you, Lane, that global partnerships are problematic. It's going to be interesting. The moment will be when the Chinese decide to sell the C919 to more foreign airlines, because they don't right now.
Yeah, I mentioned Airbus in the chat because
That's what the C
they
is. It's
their
just
their
imitating
bits are
Airbus.
made. Yeah, Airbus are made like all over the place. You'll have like a part of the tail, a small part of one of the wings, and a part of the undercarriage built in one country. Then another country gets a share of the stuff on the other side of the plane, so the same parts, but on the other side. So some
Yeah.
will get like a right aileron and a right rudder panel. Then the other country will get a left aileron and a left rudder panel. They all sort of vie for parts of the development of the production. Then they get assembled bit by bit and end up in Toulouse and put together and
Right.
flown. So it's like but it's the whole. It is like it's weird. It's like whereas we
Well,
had every country had their own aerospace industry. Now
well,
we've got really one, two, three,
well,
three.
it is a kind of pork barreling, no different than the U.S., right?
Yeah.
We divide our production up into all these things. And even though we could have one big factory, one big Fordist factory, and assemble the damn thing and machine all the stuff in the same place, but there are advantages to doing that, right? You have better,
Mhm.
milling facilities in one place, better fabrication in another,
Yeah.
uh, proximity of electronics assembly and blah 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 blah. That's just the way things are done. What the
The
problem,
F
of
30.
course,
Oh,
oh no, just the problem in waging war is that you have too much diversity, right? That's the problem with Russians having all of these Western
mm.
electronic components in their
But
missiles.
the F-35 is the same.
Oh yeah, yeah,
All the partners of the F-35 program build bits for it in different countries.
yes,
It's a strange little, but all it creates buy-in. It's sort of it's soft power,
indeed.
even
Well,
though in this
it
case it's also
ensures that
hard
you
power.
sell F-30. It ensures that you sell more F-35s overseas too, though, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it's
yeah,
got
yeah, yeah.
Swedish electronics of one kind or another, and some other bunches of things that are, part of the darn
Well,
stuff.
it ties in today. Everyone's kicking off because Britain has agreed finally to do something. Well, they've agreed to stop selling 30 things in the arms industry to Israel out of 300 and odd things that we send out there.
Yes,
Um, but they
but
said we'll
contractually,
do,
there are commitments. Contractually,
yeah,
it's unfortunate there are a tremendous number of commitments.
yeah. But they said they won't, they will always send stuff for the F-35.
Yeah.
That's what they've said. So they've got like, even if we're going out the wire and if it's for the F-35, we're still going to keep selling them it
Yes.
because because we've got no option.
Well,
Really.
it's a big commitment. The investment in this, weapons system is pretty intense. I mean, you're looking at kind of a 30-year commitment where,
Yeah,
once you start decide to do it. And Ukraine is only revealing, the war in Ukraine is revealing only these the soft underbelly, all those F-16s being moved around.
yes, yes.
Which to some people doesn't make any sense, but it's actually really important. The F-16 is is the gold standard for weapon systems and is much more diverse, and
Mhm.
they develop not even in the US, I think, some of the newer electronic stuff on it that is really kind of cool, actually. Has new
Well,
radar that or whatever sensors that can pick up shit that is very new. And if there's ever a dogfight, you'll probably never get a dogfight, but it'll be interesting to see what happens.
but the F-16s also they've allowed the design team of the original F-16. they've allowed a lot of their stuff to go out. They like the Mitsubishi make a sort of variant of the F-16.
Yes, yes,
Israel did. The Lava was like
yes,
a spin-off from the F-16 XL, which was scrapped.
yes.
Um,
Well, similarly for what is it, the Mirage? There's a yeah,
yeah. But we've done it in Britain with uh Europe since the 70s. We started off with the Seppi Cat Jaguar and the Panavia Tornado.
yes.
They were all joint enterprises with the European nations. And some dropped out, some stayed in.
Well, and the quality of, whatever combat is different, right? I mean, what the Tornado was originally designed for was, it's been sort of replaced by cruise missiles in that sense.
Yeah. The French though always try to maintain their own stuff, their own
Yeah,
industry.
yeah, it's so French.
Yeah. They make their own everything really. They've still got their own. They've actually got a huge defense industry, France.
Yeah, indeed they do.
Mm.
Indeed they do. It doesn't mean they make bad stuff. It's just that they make,
Oh no.
they make great stuff. The Cesar artillery, tube artillery thing, it has a better range than all the everything I think except the Swedish artillery piece. It's got better range. I mean, if you have an entire battery of Cesar French guns, you probably have a big advantage on the field. So anyway,
I think the Yanks will be a bit annoyed with the French though,
how's that?
because all the other stuff in the rest of the European NATO countries, they're all interoperable,
Ah, yes, that's true.
and France isn't. They make their own everything. Yeah. So
Well,
they'll work alongside or whatever, but they're not as connected, if you know what I mean.
yeah, but that joint activity has improved some of that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank God. I mean, otherwise, well, anyway.
Oh no, we've got a hard on for military. We'll end up upsetting Joe. Let's calm down. Calm down.
Indeed. To that end, I'm gonna stop the live stream so we can get on to more profane events before the writing workshop. Let me thank you for your attention.